Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Mohsin Mughal. It was a summit meant to hammer out sticking points between three countries leading the peace efforts in Syria. After all was said and done, differences remain between the presidents of Turkey, Russia and Iran. But that didn't overshadow the agreements they shared, including facilitating the return of refugees and, crucially, the setting up of a constitutional committee to determine Syria's political future. Meeting with his Russian and Iranian counterparts for the fourth time in less than a year and a half, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan called for an end to the suffering in Idlib, where a shaky ceasefire is barely holding. Russian President Vladimir Putin reiterated that the presence of fighters in Syria's last rebel stronghold shouldn't be tolerated and that a final solution was needed. But according to the Kremlin, a much-feared regime offensive won't happen for now. Looming in the background was the pending US withdrawal from northern Syria. Differences over who will fill the power vacuum left by the Americans was a touchy issue, but all leaders agreed the withdrawal was welcome. Erdogan reiterated that the Turkish military could clear the area in Syria's northeast, currently held by the US-backed YPG terror group.
Syria's territorial integrity will not be ensured unless the YPG terror group is cleared away from Manbij, east of the Euphrates.
The Iranian President Hassan Rouhani also had tough words for the US, accusing them and Israel for supporting terrorists in the region.
What the Americans do both under the current authority and the previous ones does not secure the interests of the nations of the region. What we want is for the United States to review its policies in the region.
And to discuss this further, I'm joined by Yaser Tabbara, Senior Fellow at the Omran Center, and Murat Yetkin, former Editor-in-Chief at the Hurriyet Daily News. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. We are 2 years into the Astana process. What do you think is the takeaway from this latest round of talks? Murat, you can go first.
All right. What we can take from this fourth round of meeting of three leaders is that Erdogan, for the first time, said he was hopeful for a political solution in Syria, and we see a path towards more flexibility of Ankara towards a solution with Assad in Syria. We can see this from the statements of Putin and Rouhani, who are pushing sort of Turkey for implementing Astana Protocol, which means we can get into details of Astana Protocol, but which means formally or informally acknowledgement of the present government in Syria in order to have better cooperation against terrorism, whether it's Daesh or whether it's PKK, PYD.
All right, we'll come to where this process has led. We'll get into a bit of background as well. But I'll ask this question to you, Yaser. There's been a discussion about the imminent pullout of US troops. How much of an impact will that have on the ground, and who is to benefit from that?
Well, I think the perhaps more relevant question is whether such a pullout is taking place.
Happen at all, yeah.
I mean, what we're seeing is that on the ground, in effect, we're seeing sort of the opposite of that. We're seeing that some of the American forces are being reinforced by new troops. We're seeing that the French are investing a little bit more in their presence in their sort of area. So I think there's a realization, and now you see that divide that is taking place between the White House and those who are actually implementing the policies in eastern Syria from the American administration, from the American government. It's still to be seen whether what the timeline of such a withdrawal is going to is going to look like, whether it is going to take place in the first place. But obviously there is a realization right now within the American establishment that there is the area is not ready. The security structure of that area is not ready for the Americans to pull out.
All right, I'll ask you this question, Murat. There has been a valid argument. I mean, presence of PYD, YPG terror groups in Manbij and east of Euphrates as well. For example, they are a threat to the territorial integrity of Syria as well, and that has been reiterated by all the leaders, that there is a concern that we want to keep the territorial integrity of Syria intact. But how can we deal with that threat? And that threat of YPG and terror groups like PYD are also a threat to the territorial integrity of Syria. How do we deal with that?
True, but only Turkey is prioritizing that threat as number one. In the eyes of Americans, PYD-YPG is part of Syrian Democratic Forces, is the main land force they use against Daesh. They have started another offense in Deir Zor recently, saying that this is going to be the last one. I think there's a joke going on in social media that it's 1,000th time it's the last offense. But Trump had said when he announced that there's going to be a troop withdrawal that Daesh was finished. So if Daesh had finished what we are observing now. Yeah. So this is going to continue for some more time, in my opinion. And for Russia, for example, PYD-YPG is not a number one threat. When Americans said there's going to be a troop withdrawal, we have seen through Anadolu Agency the pictures, the photos of Russian and YPG troops or militia patrolling together around Manbij. So there's a lot of double talk sort of going on in the area. Yes, everybody is saying that they are for the territorial integrity of Syria, but in which form? That's important. So
yeah, okay. Going back a little to the ground situation, Yaser, Assad regime has consistently been violating the Idlib ceasefire. They've been pounding with bombs. What does that tell us about Assad's intentions? I mean, there has been his guarantors in Sochi are talking about keeping this peace deal, at least in Idlib, intact, but he seems to be showing complete disregard for that.
Well, it's not just the Assad regime that is showing the disregard. I mean, I think even the guarantors themselves, statistically, since the conflicting zone that was decided on in Sochi back in 2018, there has been over 35 Russian air raids, for example, on Idlib. There has been over 1,000 incidents of bombardment of Idlib. About 73 or 75% of those are actually targeted towards civilians, and as opposed to what they agree on to be the common threat, which is the HES. And so I think there is definitely an intention to keep the pressure on the question of Idlib, but whether there is an intention to overtake Idlib, I think that is something that the three parties have to agree on, the Assad regime, the Russians, and the Iranians.
All right, despite that, I mean, there are definitely differences on the ground. There's a bit of doublespeak as well on part of Syria and its guarantors to a larger extent, as you've highlighted. But more or less, this process, this Astana process, has actually been more effective. Just to give our viewers a brief understanding of the whole process, I'm just quickly going over to what led up to the Thursday's trilateral summit in Sochi. It all started in January 2017 with a formal ceasefire, which was agreed to with Turkish and Russian backing. Syrian rebel leaders also met with Assad's regime for the first time there. Then in May, 4 de-escalation zones were proposed after Iran backed the peace process, beginning a rapid decline in violence across Syria. The following January, talks were then held in Sochi to supplement the Astana process. It was the largest dialogue between Syrians, with 1,500 delegates attending that round. And in September, the framework saw its biggest success after halting a regime offensive into Idlib, after the presidents of Turkey and Russia reached a deal on a demilitarized zone. I'm going to ask you this question again, and I'll start with you, Yaser. Can we say the Astana process as a whole has been more effective compared to the Geneva-led process? And if at all it has been effective, what do you think is the reason for that effectiveness?
That's sort of a tricky question, because it really depends on whose perspective you're talking about.
Okay.
Obviously, from the perspective of the Russians, who desired from the very beginning to circumvent the international process and to Astanize Geneva, if you will, they've wildly succeeded in doing that, and they have pretty much moved the initiative from you know, the international community and the Geneva communique into Astana and the Russian sort of desire on how they see a political solution should unfold in Syria. In the Geneva process, we were talking, the international community was talking about a true transitional governing body that eventually will lead into a true transition of power, into a true constitutional process that will produce a number of serious reforms that would hopefully get us to a point where we deal with the root causes of what took place in 2011 in the first place, and not repeat that vicious cycle of protests and violence. Now, the Russians, on the other hand, all they care about is to affirm, you know, the situation and the position of their client, the Assad regime, and decided to enter the process militarily and get it to where it is right now. And so, again, I mean, it really depends on which perspective.
I see Murat nodding his head. I'm not sure if he's in agreement with that, but I'll ask you a very specific question.
I want to add one detail to what Yaser had said.
Okay, I'll let you do that.
I think Russian and Iranian positions vis-à-vis Assad regime is not the same. Okay. They're saying this openly now. Yeah. Rouhani had a statement. I think all Russia is caring for is to extend its zone of influence in the Middle East. I mean, it was non-existent, but thanks to Obama's hesitation in 2013, Russia is back. So with or without Assad, Russia wants to stay there, but Iran has to stick with Assad regime. That's what I want to say.
Okay, that's the crux of it. But I just want to come to a very specific thing that I've been wanting to ask and find out. And I'm going to read this out to you, Murat. The Turkish president said during the conference with his counterparts, Vladimir Putin and Hassan Rouhani yesterday, and he said, "We have preserved the spirit of the Astana process despite the problems and provocations." I just want to understand and help us understand this. We understand the problems and differences are there, but what are these provocations that the president is referring to?
There's a few, but mainly he's talking about the PYD, the presence of PYD and American collaboration with PYD forces against Daesh, or in order to make a permanent presence in east of Euphrates, in northeast of Syria, perhaps in parallel with the desires of Israeli government as well, because they want a buffer zone, whether it's a Kurdish buffer zone or Martian buffer zone, whatever, between Iran and themselves.